And a very warm welcome to our viewers of Punkt, and a very warm welcome to our guest, Mr. Nils Schmid, who is member of the German Bundestag and a party spokesman for SPD Party for International Relations. Very warm welcome, Mr. Schmid.
Hello.
So today we'll be talking about the Russo-European and the relations, and about the conflict upcoming, or maybe not so much upcoming, between Russia and Ukraine, and how that is shaping. And what we will try to get at is the German perspective on the whole thing. So first things first, let's start with a piece of news that has broken out a few days ago. Our viewers might not have heard about it, but the office of Deutsche Welle, the German public broadcaster, a television, has lost its license to operate out of Moscow. So effectively, it has been kicked out of Russia. They had to close the whole thing down. And the question for you, Mr. Schmid, is what impact will that have on German-Russian relations, and what signal is that sending to Berlin?
Well, it's a very bad signal. And I'm sure that Chancellor Scholz will raise the issue when he flies to Moscow next week. Media freedom in Russia has been under pressure for many years now. And closing down Deutsche Welle Russia is just another example of how repressive the regime has come when it comes to media freedom. Obviously, it's a reprisal because Russia Today didn't get a license under German television law, but Russia Today is free to operate in Germany. Russia Today journalists are still working in Germany. They publish their websites and the like. So I think that once again, Putin and his government show the true character of the current regime in Russia, which is oppressive, which is decreasing individual liberties and the space for political pluralism. And it's also opposed to any open political discourse in Russia, which prevents Russia from discussing the major issues for its future, and also to have conflicting views on how Russia should evolve in the future, its society, its economy. And I think that is to the detriment of Russia itself. So it's not so much about Deutsche Welle, but it's about Russia, about democracy, rule of law, individual liberties in Russia, and they are on a steady decline and have been for many years now, unfortunately.
Okay, and of course, nowadays it is impossible to talk about Russia without talking about Ukraine. So the question for you, and what you get at, is the German perspective on the whole thing. So the right-wing Polish media will have us believe that Mr. Putin any day now is going to enter on a tank. The question for you is, how real really is that threat of a full-scale invasion to take over Ukraine by Russia?
So, first of all, let me state that the danger is real. There is a massive build-up of Russian troops all along the Ukrainian border, not only in eastern Ukraine. And so the Russian military now has the power, has the relevant weaponry assembled to start a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's for sure. Western intelligence tells us that this is a real probability, but I think in terms of political odds, it would be highly risky for Putin to launch another military attack on Ukraine. But we have to brace for the worst after the experience of the Crimea annexation and of the Russian supported attack on eastern Ukraine. So it's good that we as allies within NATO, within the European Union, have been standing together, have been sending very clear messages to Moscow that another military attack or the use of gas as a weapon would result in the breakup of relations between Russia and the West, and that Russia would have to pay a huge price in case of another military aggression. A credible deterrence is very important, and a united front of NATO, of Europeans and Americans is also very important. But I want also to emphasize that this crisis should be resolved by diplomatic means. And so I'm very glad to see that over the last 2 weeks, diplomatic efforts have been stepped up by all relevant actors in the West, starting from President Biden, including the Weimar Triangle meeting this week in Berlin, including Macron's visit to Moscow, and of course, now continuing with the travel plans of Chancellor Scholz to Kiev and Moscow next week. This is really about our common European security, about peace in Europe, and to preserve peace in Europe. It's good to have this diplomacy now gaining traction.
Okay, so you are talking about maintaining peace in Europe. And in this context, I would like to ask you about the American involvement in the whole thing. So from our perspective, is getting Washington involved really helping to resolve the issue, knowing how tense the Russo-Americans relations have been and are currently? Is that really bringing some goodwill to the table?
Yes, I do. I'm very much pleased with the involvement of the Biden administration in Europe and in NATO. I believe that we need a strong alliance and we need a clear commitment by the US government for NATO and its allies in Europe. And that has been the first and major message conveyed by Biden's visit to Brussels last summer. And he also strongly supports the European Union, which was not the case under Trump. And so I'm confident that not only the message and the commitment is right, but also that close coordination is going on between European allies and the American government. That was on display over the last month, and that was, in my eyes, crucial to uphold a credible deterrence, but also to open space for diplomacy. And now, when it comes to the specifics of solving the conflict in eastern Ukraine, of course, the Normandy Group is still the only viable framework, and the Minsk Agreement is still the only existent legal framework we have at our disposal. So I'm very glad to hear from Blinken, Foreign Minister Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, and President Biden, that they fully back the Normandy format negotiations that have started 2 weeks ago. And we do not need new formats. We do not need new US involvement in formal terms. What we need is political support from the US to bring about progress within the Normandy format. And I think the most immediate, the most urgent progress to be made in this format should be the implementation, the full implementation of the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine and the full withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Russian troops from the Ukrainian border. And as long as we stand together, as long as we have a unequivocal political backing from Washington on that matter, Europeans, especially France and Germany as part of the Normandy group, can continue their diplomatic work. And let's hope that this can contribute to diffuse tensions in Ukraine.
Okay, you talking about hope. What I would like to ask you is about the objectives Putin might have in his mind by creating this whole conflict, by putting all those troops on the Ukrainian border. We hear in the Polish media, the Polish public broadcast, controlled by the current right-wing government, is creative a narrative that Mr. Putin wants to re-establish USSR and conquer the whole world, etc., etc. From your perspective as a SPD party spokesman on international relations, what do you think could be the objective, the reason that Putin is doing all this?
I do not believe that he wants to re-establish the USSR. That would be way too expensive, too costful for Russia to bear. We already see that the costs for supporting the separatists in eastern Ukraine are quite huge. I believe the most important motivation for Putin is just to stay in power and to prevent former Soviet republics to become full-fledged democracy, offering prosperity and social justice and bright prospects for the future in the immediate neighborhood of Russia, because this would put into doubt his way of governing Russia and would show to Russians that there are alternatives to a oil and gas-based economy that more or less stagnates, and to a power vertical, to a oppressive political regime that does not allow for dissent and for political competition. So this is his main driver, not so much a nostalgia about the Soviet Union. And then there is a foreign policy objective, which is not so much about territories to be reclaimed. It's about status. It's about the desire from the Russian side to be treated as a great power. That's why he aims at having direct contact with the Americans. And to a certain degree, this is unavoidable, because if we talk nuclear weapons in Europe, we talk about American and Russian nuclear weapons, of course, not so much about Greek or Croatian or Italian German atomic bombs. So as in the past, bilateral arms control talks between Russia and the US would be very welcome. And we as Europeans, we should welcome it and support it. When it comes to broader issues of European security, conventional weapons, deployment of troops, limitations on the deployment of troops and heavy arms throughout the continent, then of course all European nations, be they member of NATO or not, must get involved. And this can also be the outcome of the ongoing diplomatic efforts to create a framework to negotiate restrictions on the deployment of troops and weapons on the European continent. And this could enhance security of Ukraine and Georgia, of Eastern Europe, of the whole of Europe. But this would also mean to include Russian weapons in Kaliningrad, Russian weapons and troop deployments in the western part of the Russian Federation. And we will see if Putin is ready to start such a conversation. It would be in the interest of all of us to have this debate because we have seen over the last 10, 20 years that it was conventional warfare that threatened the territorial integrity of European states, especially in the post-Soviet space. So we should concentrate on efforts to bring back disarmament and arms control issues to the negotiation table, either in a bilateral format when it comes to nuclear bombs and nuclear weapons, or in a European format when it comes to conventional weapons. I think this is overdue, and we should send signals to Russia that we are ready to talk about this without giving up on the substance of territorial integrity and sovereignty of European states, such as they regained or got independence after the breakup of the Soviet bloc and of the Soviet Union.
Mr. Biden also said that if the conflict escalates, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will be shut down. And the question for you is, well, first of all, is it in Mr. Biden's power to decide whether Nord Stream 2 is shut down or not? That's one thing. And secondly, is the German government fully behind it? Is Nord Stream 2 going to be completely shut down should conflict escalate?
As Chancellor Scholz put it during his visit in Washington, all options for sanctions are on the table, and we should not start taking one single option off the table. And we should also not start by by singling out one item of this list. So all options are on the table. That does include the whole of the energy sector and all pipelines, of course, Nord Stream 2 being one of them. I think that we should maintain a certain level of strategic ambiguity when dealing with Putin, so that he cannot start counting or calculating which price he would have to pay in case of a military aggression. So it's very important to have a wide array of sanctions available, from the banking sector to the energy sector to personal sanctions against officials in Russia, but also a possible ban on the export of high-tech products. So I think we must be very clear that we are ready to bear the burden, to bear the costs of sanctions as Western alliance, but also that the price would be really, really hard for Russia, and in case of an aggression. So I think we should not emphasize too much Nord Stream 2. I understand that this has been a debate for many years, and there has been concern about this pipeline, because it's not just a pipeline. It has a geopolitical dimension attached to it. And for too long, past German governments have not acknowledged this political dimension. And so we fully understand that for Ukraine, this pipeline specifically is a threat. But as I've said, for us, it's clear that all options are on the table, and if needed, we will agree on the necessary sanctions as an alliance within the European Union and within NATO.
Okay. We've seen in the past that whenever the West, the US, imposes new sanctions on Russia, what happens as a result is that the political support for Putin and his government goes up. So this is something that in political science they refer to as rallying to the king. So whenever there is a external threat, the electorate, Russian voters, tend to gather their towards those ruling in power. So we've seen in the past that the sanctions aimed at Russia have not given the West the kind of results that we were hoping for. So the question for you is there a plan B apart from sanctions aimed at politicians, aimed at some industry? Is there any other plan B? Are there any other ways we could put pressure on Mr. Putin and his government?
I'm well aware of this rallying around the flag effect that sanctions usually have. In this case, we want to use possible sanctions as a deterrent to prevent Putin from attacking Ukraine. It's not about punishing afterwards, after an aggression. It's about preventing an aggression and maintaining peace, as far we can talk of peace in eastern Ukraine these days, but still to prevent another military attack on Ukraine. So I think we will have to concentrate on this deterrence effect of sanctions, not on the effects of sanctions being imposed and being implemented. That's my first point. My second point is that you are right. Sanctions against Russia have not really brought change in domestic politics in Russia itself. And Putin has turned more and more authoritarian and has more and more isolated Russia from the West and from international relations in a broader sense. So economic cooperation has been made much more difficult. Now with the newly introduced health checks, engagement from foreign companies in Russia has become less attractive. And so I think what we should do is to focus more on resilience. Resilience in neighbor states, in Russia's neighbor states. That is what the German government has been doing since 2014 by investing lots of money and giving a lot of support to economic and judicial reform in Ukraine and in other places as well. And we have also to harness ourselves to become more resilient against malign interference from Russia and other authoritarian regimes by tackling disinformation campaigns, but by also addressing the very large and important challenge of kleptocracy, of oligarchs investing in Western countries, in real estate, through tax evasion schemes, through shell companies. I think that Biden was right to establish a summit for democracy and to start talking about all these issues with allies around the world. It's not only about Russia, it's also about us, about the resilience of our democratic systems of governance, our open societies, which are, of course, more vulnerable than societies which are not as open, which are governed by authoritarian regimes with a huge decrease of rule of law and with no supervision and no oversight by independent media.
Okay, so let's assume that one of these scenarios materializes, and in fact, America does impose economic sanctions, tough sanctions on Russia. Does that mean that Europe will have to buy American gas, which, as we know, is more expensive, and also which we know is also less ecological due to the process of fracking, which is used to extract it?
Well, first of all, we will have to see which kind of sanctions we will agree upon. If it is the energy sector, of course, and if it's agreed upon by NATO and the European Union, we all will have to bear the costs of it. That would mean that for a certain period of time, there might be more gas imports from other places through LNG terminals. But I think the more important feature of this debate is to decrease our dependency on gas and oil in general by speeding up the transition towards renewable energy sources and towards green hydrogen. And this should create a new pattern of interdependencies in the energy sector, which hopefully differs from what we are experiencing today. So when we fully transition to renewables, we will see much more sources of energy. So we might import green hydrogen from Australia. We might import green hydrogen from North Africa, and maybe also from Russia and Ukraine. Why not? But we should try to become less dependent on a restricted number of energy suppliers. That is the geopolitical background of the energy transition we are in. And the European Union has decided with the Green New Deal that we want to support the member states in doing so. I know that Poland is also keen to start this transition to, for example, to give up coal. And we need a new form of European solidarity and also common funds to finance this transition, so that Russia will not be able to blackmail any European country, be it part of the European Union or not, like Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Polish government has proven the last few months not to be too effective with resolving conflicts. We've seen the current right-wing government pumping up rhetoric against Russia, also some anti-German rhetoric. I don't see how that could be helpful to resolving anything, especially trying to gather troops and to create some kind of solidarity within the European Union. But looking at Germany per se and Germany's role in this last question, just to summarize this conversation a little bit, I would like to ask you, how do you see it playing out in the next few months, and what role Germany could play in moving it forward, hopefully to a peaceful solution?
So, in brief, Germany is following a dual track approach. On the one side, credible deterrence through the list of sanctions that is on the table and that is coordinated closely with our allies in NATO and in the European Union. And on the other hand, a strong support and a strong involvement, a strong commitment to diplomacy, because we believe the best way to bring back peace to Ukraine and to maintain the relative level of peace we have in Ukraine, with the exception of eastern Ukraine, is diplomacy. And that's why we are so much engaged in the Normandy group. And that's why Chancellor Scholz is going to travel to Kiev and Moscow. We are in a mediator position because we are a guarantor state of the Minsk agreement. This does not mean that we are neutral. We stand with Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, but we respect our mediator role, and we do fulfill this role in close consultation with our allies. That is also the reason why the German government will not send weapons to Ukraine, in order not to undermine this mediation role we have been assigned to through the Minsk agreement. And I'm confident that diplomacy will prevail and that we will not only avert another military attack, but that we will be able to create different frameworks for negotiating common security risks in Europe among Europeans, including Russia, and to find maybe more viable solutions to these threat perceptions on all sides. But this is a very hard work that is still ahead of us, but we should not give up on trying it the diplomatic way.
Fantastic. And for that, I think we will keep our fingers crossed. I hope this conversation shed some light on how this whole thing could be resolved. Thank you very much, Mr. Schmid. And thank you very much to our viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.